in a customer experience, there is a reasonable end. Why aren't companies focused on that?
We've actually got enormous vocabularies around that in a sort of sociological sense, in a theological sense.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've done is totally forget about that in the emotions to the consumer life cycle. We've been too busy making sales and making products that we've left the end for someone else to clear up.
Customer experience wisdom, a dash of travel talk. We've been cleared for takeoff.
The best meals are served outside and require a passport.
Welcome back, CX Passport travelers. Today's guest is Joe Macleod. Joe is our first guest from Sweden, which, that gets me super excited. We get to help fill the map. He's also British by background, which gives him this interesting lens on how customer experience shows up across cultures and across systems. He's best known for his work on endings in customer experience, an area most organizations still avoid or just hand off to someone else entirely. He's the author of 2 books focused on how products, services, and relationships end. And when Joe talks about endings in today's context, it may not mean exactly what you think it means. When Joe and I talked earlier, we also discovered, we share a similar family name, which led to a quick detour into Scottish tartans before we got back to talking about CX and customer behavior. And one note before we get started, Joe's going to offer some discounts for CX Passport listeners at the end of the show, so stick around for that. Joe, welcome to CX Passport.
Thanks a lot, Rick. Great to be here and been enjoying chatting already, but really enjoying and looking forward to this podcast as well.
Yeah, isn't that kind of fun? Sometimes the pre-record is a fun chat. However, I know that the active record is going to be a fun chat as well. I want to talk about that endings, that a lot of your work focuses on endings and customer experience, but not in this narrow way we often talk about endings and things like the peak end theory.
Yeah.
How do you define endings more broadly? And why do you think organizations struggle to engage with endings?
Well, maybe it would help like putting a bit of context on how I got here as well, because I think most businesses, and I was there as a creator, as a designer, we have so much history about designing and creating the beginning of the customer engagement, whether that's through design or marketing and telling stories. And we do overlook that last part. But I encountered this I was doing some teaching years ago, and I set a sort of cliche brief, I guess, in for the students of waste and matter in the world. And everyone went off and created more like marketing material about waste and matter in the world. And it was sort of really philosophically disruptive to me, to the point where I didn't have an answer to what the right solution was. But it started that journey, that sort of question and that itch, that sort of intellectual itch that you have for creation. And so then rolling forward like nearly 20 years actually from that very early experience, I went off and done my career and stuff, but then came back and looked at the ending stuff through the first 2 books. But what I found for most industries and businesses is that we don't even ask the question of how does this end? Not as a material thing or a recycling thing or a reporting thing or a legislation thing, but we don't ask the really key question of how does this end as an experience? And that's really what I'm about.
That last part got me. Why? I mean, well, actually, the cliche is death and taxes, right? And so all of us have some sort of ending. We don't have to go to the darkness of death. But in a customer experience, there is a reasonable end. Why aren't companies?
I actually used that very quote, the death and taxes quote, in the book at one of the beginning of the chapters. And it does cover a lot of bases. Humans actually have enormous vocabularies about endings and how we leave a thing, whether that be through death or transitions of age, that you might change at a certain period in your life and you say goodbye to being younger and hello to being older. And we've actually got enormous vocabularies around that in a sort of sociological sense, in a theological sense. And what we've done is totally forget about that in terms of applying the emotions to the consumer life cycle. We've been too busy making sales and making products that we've left the end for someone else to clear up.
This is your captain speaking. I want to thank you for listening to CX Passport today. We've now reached our cruising altitude, so I'll turn that seatbelt sign off. While you're getting comfortable, hit that follow or subscribe button on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Love it if you'd tell a friend about CX Passport, leave a review so others can discover the show as well. Now, sit back and enjoy the rest of the episode.
We were talking about the other podcast that I'm a part of, The Loud Quiet, and in
Exactly.
there we have an episode about a phrase that has become a little bit popular in the US, Swedish death cleansing. And so I wonder if some of it is even just the culture in where you live and some of that aspect. I want to bring more of that idea of endings into this.
Yeah.
And you mentioned sort of the religious aspect of it and the emotional aspect of it. You've talked about this idea of shame at the end of a customer journey, especially when we're talking about circularity and circular economy. Can you help me understand, what do you mean by shame at the end? And why is it that businesses tend to step away and treat this, well, that's for an NGO to handle, or it's a legislation and regulatory problem?
Exactly. So we've dropped I'd say almost the empowerment. If you think of the empowerment of the individual and having agency as an individual, what we've done in consumerism, whether you're doing digital, physical, or service sector products, we have been everything about encouraging. Oh, thank you for becoming our customer. We're doing all of this encouragement, this emotional encouragement and then we're creating these systems and interfaces to give people enormous amounts of agency to right at the beginning of the customer service, the customer life cycle, to investigate a product. So amazing empowerment to investigate. Say you're buying a car, to investigate the enormous range of vehicles across different factors, and then reviews, and then going through the purchase experience. If you think about the purchase of clothes, for example, how we pull people into a website and then give them the ability to measure things and then even try it on. And so at each of these stages, it's empowerment, it's encouragement, it's agency, and then you're into the interface of a powerful tool or something like that. So amazing experience for the consumer throughout that consumer life cycle. And then we get to the end, and then a consumer will want to leave. I say at the beginning of some of my talks, like, I'm married. That ends in one of two ways. And if your customers aren't going to leave you, you're insane. So the perception of one of the most important relationships I have in my life, I know ends in one of two ways. And I go into so many businesses and they haven't got any vocabulary about how it ends for the customer. So what we tend to do in business is to just leave that or deny it. And we deny it through things like dark patterns, trying to send them down rabbit holes, collusion, and then also what we also do is to encourage them maybe to ring up a call center, use some sort of 18th century tool like a telephone and a human that we don't use in the rest of the consumer life cycle to onboard and facilitate many of our interactions in the modern world. But we ask them to then ring someone up at the end, like they haven't really moved into digitization. And so then we also start to talk about a different thing entirely at the end. So at the last quadrant, the offboarding, if you're in physical products, you'll start to talk about plastics. Plastics never turn up anywhere else in the customer life cycle at the beginning. So no one goes, I'm just popping down the road to buy some plastics. No one ever says that. But at the end, all of a sudden, I've got loads of different plastics and I need to think about what the chemical makeup is. I'm abandoned by the company. I'm on my own now. I'm an individual. I'm a member of society. I have to now separate materials into different sections. Or I've got to, for example, in the digital space, I've got to work out how long my relationship is with this company, how much data I have with them, how can I remove that? I've got to start managing that stuff myself. And so what we've ended up doing is creating this, in experiential terms, a cliff edge where we've got agency, we've got emotion, we've got engagement, and they drop right off a cliff and the consumer's abandoned. And in that abandonment, we don't instruct, we often shame. And to come back to shame, the difference between guilt and shame is about your agency around the event that happened. So if, for example, I'd done something bad and I was caught, I can then say, or I acknowledge it, even if I was intending to do it or not. I can acknowledge it and say, I'm sorry about that. I feel guilty about that, and I'm going to correct it. But what we've done with the consumer is bamboozle them in this space of complexity, of legislation, of materials, of chemicals, to a space where they're totally dizzy with responsibility. And we also create this sort of shame environment where we're all guilty because we've consumed. And what we need to start doing is structure this place to a far better level of understanding, of instruction and bonding.
I want to come back to that consuming element of it, because there's a shame element, there's a reward element of it, all of that sort of coming together in this ending that is not well understood and well explained. I have an example from my family that someone just in my family wrapped up a long-term relationship with a telecom provider. It was the provider of an old way of delivering television service to their house. Right, and they had all of this equipment in the house, which in the past was, make sure it gets returned and all that. The email that they got from the company was like, we don't need it anymore. So here's a link to your state's recycling program. And that just left sort of a kind of meh taste in my family members' mouth and mine as well of, wait, this is your stuff. And now it's my responsibility to dispose of it. If I chuck it in the garbage, I'll feel guilty. And it wasn't even really my, air quote here, responsibility.
Absolutely. There's loads of psychology around how damaging abandoning people in this placement are. And some of them go back to the way that you leave them in that last quadrant will trigger memories which are similar sort of cognitive load to earlier relationship sort of experiences earlier on in the relationship. So if you give somebody a bad offboarding experience, that will trigger memories which earlier in the relationship were more as negative. So they have an equal sort of impedance. Bad experience at the end triggers bad experience in the middle. So you start to embed memories which are more negative if you're not engaging at the end. So when you talked about the consumer at the end, and to your friend's issue, your family member's issue, how that gets done, obviously maybe that's the best route for the material matter to go to the right facility, etc., etc. But how that gets done is the key to how we're building experiences, and we're not doing enough work in it.
No, we felt completely abandoned, 100%. And there's a totally different way to handle that. Now, I want to take a complete shift here because I want to learn more about you and being in Sweden, because you are our first guest from there. I know you're British by background. You've lived in Stockholm for years now. So when you look at customer experience and just consumer expectations, what are the differences that stand out to you, and where are you seeing similarities?
So, I mean, these are very generalizations. We can't organize a whole culture.
I want you to speak of the entire culture.
But I'll have a crack at it for argument's sake. So Swedes are really honourable and they're really thoughtful about things. And so I found a really good example was a friend of mine. He was a project manager and he used to manage teams in Sweden and in the UK. And he said when he managed teams in Sweden, it would take a long time for everyone to discuss everything that was going to happen about the project. And then they'll steadily move off and hit the deadline accurately and with purpose together. And what happens with the British, they all run off in different directions, realize they've got it wrong, and then come back together to build consensus. So I think that characterizes both societies. And I think when we misunderstand a lot of the Nordics as being slow, but what they're doing is really building consensus really well. And when you live here, you realize that how good the society is in terms of having consensus and understanding how systems work and building complexity over the long term, because they're not fumbling in the short term like I think the British do. So with that at the basis, what you end up with is really solid sort of products, and quite well thought through products. They're a very big engineering background. They do a lot of mining, forestry, and they've got a big history of building that, and military stuff as well. And so they've got some really good products they've built. In terms of customer centric things, I think what I found really interesting is when you move here, you realize, oh, I didn't know that was a Swedish company. They're really good at building companies which are totally ambiguous and could be from America, could be from another place in Europe. So I didn't know. So things like that are really funny. I mean, you've got classics like IKEA, but a lot of people don't realize Spotify's from Sweden.
Right. Yeah.
Like Electrolux is Swedish, and they own lots of other brands like AEG.
Right.
And so there's stacks of those things which I think are really good at. And because it's a small country with a small language or small language speaking, they're great at using stuff in British and creating English language products. So yeah, I think they've got lots of things where they're really good at, and so it's been interesting living here and working with them.
Well, Joe, I know that the trip from England to Sweden is not the longest, but if I were to go to Sweden, or to England for that matter, from the U.S., it's a pretty long trip, and it's nice to have a first-class lounge to stop off in. So I'm going to invite you to do that today with me. Let's stop off in the first-class lounge. We'll move quickly here and have a little bit of fun. What is a dream travel location from your past?
Oh, we recently went to Norway, down the fjords, canoeing.
Nice.
And we were really lucky with the weather. Even though it was September, the weather was absolutely amazing. And just being in a little boat at the bottom of a fjord with, 1,000 meter mountains right next to you, it was absolutely mind-blowing because it's such a scale thing.
Yeah.
And it was so quiet as well. It was super weird. It was lovely.
That's awesome. That's one of those that feels like we see the pictures. I can see the fjords.
Yeah.
And I imagine being there, it's one of those that's the classic. It just is not the same in the picture. There is a totally different experience.
No.
What about going forward? What's a dream travel location you've not been to yet?
I've done the Far East a few times in different places, but there's some places I'd like to do. Vietnam. And actually, I haven't done Thailand. My wife's done Thailand. I'd like to do that. I'd actually really like to see some icebergs and like that type of thing. We've done the Arctic. We went up to the Arctic because Sweden obviously has some parts in the Arctic. We went on Arctic in the winter with -20, and then we've done the Arctic this summer, and it's super strange going to the Arctic in the summer. Not right up, obviously, into the poles, but within the Arctic Circle, because it's 100% sun, and you're up in the middle of the night, and it looks
suddenly you've been up for 3 days and you're thinking, wait, I probably should get some sleep, but there's no environmental clue that says go to bed.
Yeah,
you mentioned Thailand, and it's one of my favorite places. And one of the reasons is because of the food. Now, not to push you towards Thai food here, but what is a favorite thing of yours to eat?
I had some Spanish really good versions of the olive, where they put the olive and the fish next to one another in a little cocktail stick. It tastes amazing when it's done right. That's a really little favorite. And langoustines when they're barbecued, basically like small bits of seafood are really good.
Oh, I bet so. That does sound nice. Well, I'm going to take you the other direction. What is something you were forced to eat growing up, but you hated as a kid?
I still hate it now because I was forced to. In fact, there's two. When I'm coming back to the Scottish thing, my grandfather on my father's side was the Scottish. I'm quarter Scottish with the Macleod name. And we used to stay over there. But he'd eat porridge with salt in it. And they push us to finish our breakfast. When you and you know when you're sometimes and there's be this massive bowl of almost salted porridge, and that just put me off porridge forever, and also bad liver as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Is there such a thing as good liver, for that matter? I have no love for the liver when it comes to food. Well, that's interesting, the Scottish influence there. Joe, it's time for us to leave the first class lounge. What is one travel item, not including your phone, not including your passport, that you will not leave home without?
My Kindle, actually. I've recently got a new Kindle, and I love it because hasn't got you can just about buy something on their very rudimentary system, but basically you can't browse the internet, no one can get you, no one can message you, and so it's just amazing. I love it, and I love the just the capability now is so good on the screens, and feels like a really good reading experience. Oh, it's so light as well. Love it.
Joe, it's been a while since I was a Kindle user. I have found myself migrating towards, I want that tangible book in my hand. However, man, there's something to having that just slim device that allows you to read anything you want, anytime. And you call that something that I don't often think about. You're not connected to anything else. So
No.
you are able to read it without
Absolutely.
interruption. And I love that.
It's also, as you get older, it becomes more of an issue with the holding thing. And I feel the sort of crunchy in my hand. It's,
yeah. I don't want to admit that. However, it's very true as well. And I have felt that as well. Well, let's get back to talking about endings and customer experience. And you have spent a lot of time thinking about consumer history, industrial history, and even religion. We've talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
When you ask questions like what the Industrial Revolution might have looked like, well, if it emerged from a Buddhist or a Shinto tradition instead of out of a Western tradition, what does that help us understand about consumption today?
So in terms of reflection about the end and looking towards the end of life, different religions have different relationships to it. Many religions, whether you're Muslim or Christian or all sorts of religions, really, have an aspect to looking at beyond life after death to a place which is abundant and all about consumption, unwielding consumption, just endless consumption. And so very deep in our psychology, we've got this programmed relationship with our arc of life, which is about one day I'll be able to indulge myself without any question. And so I think it's super. And then rolling back from that, the heaven thing, we look into different religions and we can see, for example, between the Protestant and the Catholic version of Christianity. In the Catholic route, you can often get forgiveness as you guide yourself towards the end of life. So I sinned, I feel sorry about the sin, I'm renouncing that, stuff like that. So get forgiveness on God. In the Protestant religion, you don't get any opportunity. You get judged at the end of life and the pearly gates. I'm simplifying it just for the discussion, but sort of like we've got lots of stuff around the end of life and how we move towards that end in our deeper sociological, theological relationship with how we live in life. Not really the opposite, but a religion which looks, and many of these other religions don't look at products as having life in them. But in Shinto Buddhism, you look at objects of having a life. There's an animism in that object. And with that, you also die, and you can also say thank you to the object. And so a good example, which I write about in the first book, the Ends book, is the Tailors Union in Japan. They go to the Shinto Buddhist temple and they take their needles. And with the needle, they say goodbye to the needle And because the needle's done such hard work, they put it into a piece of tofu. And you can imagine how soft that is into the
Yeah.
tofu. And there's such symbolism in that. And then they take these needles and tofu, and then they process that in a religious sense in the temple to say goodbye to the needles and respect the needles' work. And there's also now, roll forward hundreds of years, you've got Barbie dolls get processed, tens of thousands in a place outside Tokyo, and different temples do different things, as it were. So amazing. So if you think about that respect to the end and the sense of vocabulary about the end of a product and the richness and meaning around that, we don't have that in the West. We imagine if we had grown up with the Industrial Revolution with such a lot of respect about the meaning of the end, in a sense of how we now talk about circularity in such a simplistic, cold-hearted way with chemistry and materials and recycling and legislation. And you think of the absence of that vocabulary of meaning and emotion, which we could have if potentially the Industrial Revolution started in a Buddhist Shinto society.
It's one to sit on for a little bit. That the idea of this, well, certainly it's always kind of fun to think about alt history.
Yeah.
Right. What would that, just forget the topic. It's always interesting to think about that. And then idea, because as you pointed out, consumption is the reward. As you were describing, in a lot of our, and forget it, like, yes, in the religious faith system and just in life. Hey, if you work hard, you get to go buy your boat and go water skiing on the weekend, which I love water skiing. So not that that's inherently bad, but that is kind of the consumption is the reward. And I think what you're describing is a lot of companies view that consumption as a reward, but then they don't think about that end story of it. Like if I'm talking to someone about their product, I'm going to get incredible detail and passion about the product.
Yeah.
But if I say, all right, so what's the end of that product look like? They're going to look at me blankly like, why?
Exactly.
Let me talk about it. Why does that happen? And then what does that mean? What does that lack of awareness really mean if we're not appreciating the end?
In monetary terms, I find it really interesting because when I go into places and offer my services, they talk and say, like, so what's the sort of, for example, the ROI of endings? What does that mean? Or if I spend loads of money, for example, getting compliance around greenhouse gas emissions, what does that mean? So we've monetized the end in terms of values and feedback, and we've data-driven it. And what I find fascinating is the damage we do to brands in that space. And so when you look at different companies, and we're now getting to the point, and if you put in legislation around data and digital products with GDPR or CCPA or something, you're into the hundreds of thousands of pounds a year to defend those things. If you're asking questions about how much we're spending at the end of product life because of our reporting or because of our legislation or stuff like that, I want you to then ask, how much money are we losing because we drop people off a cliff at the end in terms of a brand? How much money does it take us to then regain that customer? And I'm not talking about retention things, because often they do more damage than but really create an ending which has meaning and emotion and values that experience without it having to become another experience to then fulfill that thing. But it's that brand equity loss at the end, which is worth hundreds of thousands, even millions to businesses, which we haven't had a vocabulary about.
I kind of like I'm visualizing, my Western mindset doesn't have the ability to come up with an example that quickly, but the idea of whatever experience that I'm doing, but then it ends in some sort of Shinto temple type experience that, okay, well, I'm done with this product. And now it has that sort of ending. Joe, this is, well, you know what? I'm kind of glad this is going to be the 250th episode, because this one's kind of milestone-y. It's different. We went on different directions here.
Yeah.
Joe, this is one of those that I think folks are going to want to know a little bit more about you, get in touch with you. And you mentioned an offer. Tell me, how can folks get to know a little bit more about you?
Sure. So you can go to the business website, which is called andend.co. And there's loads of stuff on there about me and the business and what I do. Get me on LinkedIn. I'm always on there. look at the books. They're on Amazon. The Ends book, that's the sort of foundational book that started me on this journey.
Mm-hmm.
That's on there, and that will talk to you about if you're interested in the history and the psychology and the theology of it all. That I found really inspiring, and that's what started me on the journey. If you're into the practice of endings, there's the Engineering book, and that's also on Amazon. Both are available as digital books, so you can get them on your Amazon Kindles. Then you can also become an engineer. So that's the training program I offer. There's a introduction to engineering, which I'm going to give you the discount codes. I'll put them in the show notes.
Perfect.
And then there's the advanced one. If you're a business looking at engaging in this space more, then you can look at the advanced one, and you can find out more about that on the website.
That's awesome. Yes, absolutely. I'll get all that in the show notes. It will be a click or a code that you'll then have available to you there, and you'll be able to head over and get to know Joe and get to know a little bit more about his programs. Joe, I'm not being blowing sunshine up your fanny here. I plan to go out and get that Ends book because the conversation today has me mighty intrigued, and I'm looking forward to that. I mean, I think about our conversation today. It involved things like, customer experience, peak end, but it also had sin and forgiveness and, environmental issues. So this was a wonderfully, delightfully wide-ranging conversation today, Joe. Thank you for being on CX Passport.
Thank you very much, Rick. And it was a pleasure chatting to you. Thanks very much.